Okay, let's get started here. Oh, there we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome and welcome back to Cafe Oleh, and welcome especially to our spring sessions. My name is Jay. Here at Cafe Oleh with Nefesh B'Nefesh, we go over the everyday Hebrew you need here in Israel to succeed, whether that's reading and paying your bills, going grocery shopping and reading nutritional labels, keeping up with the news, striking up a conversation, flirting, dating, job interviewing, complaining, all the everyday things you do in your native language in your country of origin, but here in Israel in modern Hebrew. As always, we'd love to hear from you what topics you'd like us to cover. Cafe Ole only succeeds when we hear from you what topics you'd like us to cover, and the vast majority of our topics come from participants like you. You can always be in touch with us by email at hebrew@nbn.org.il. If you're joining us live on Zoom, you can write to us in the chat with any questions, comments, concerns, and requests for topics you may have. You can also see all of our previous lessons on YouTube. And as always, I'm here to demonstrate how you see all of our previous lessons, in addition to going to the Nefesh B'Nefesh website. Watch very carefully, and remember, all of our classes are recorded, so if this is too fast for you, you can always come back. So first off, where are we? If you go to youtube.com, for those of you who don't know YouTube, this is youtube.com, and I type in Cafe Oleh, the name of our program here. If I click, the very first entry search result is going to be our playlist. Click here, view full playlist. Okay, and I see that we have 158 videos. That means there are 158 lessons here with 26,010 views. This is thanks to you. And these are here for your convenience to watch on demand. We have lots of participants who don't join us live, either because they can't or they prefer to go at their own pace. You yourselves can do that whenever you would like by going to this page. You can also bookmark it and get any updates directly to your YouTube account. You can see all of our previous lessons here. And if you want to see if we covered something else, very simple. For those of you who don't know how to use the search function, just type in Cafe Oleh. And you can type in, for example, you see a whole bunch here, right? Cafe Oleh Medical. Has Jay covered medical before? Yes, he's covered medical terms. He's covered healthcare before. Okay, so please use this. This is an amazing resource. Which much thanks to Nefesh B'Nefesh for recording and uploading these videos. So please, folks, check out youtube.com before you get in touch with us and ask us, have we covered an issue or not? We get lots of emails, and I'm still waiting through weeks worth of emails. I'm trying to get to everyone, but please check the YouTube account before you get in touch with us to ask, have we covered this before? And be creative. It may not be the exact word you use to describe something, but chances are we may have covered it already. That being said, it's our spring session. We have lots of content for you coming up and lots of great classes. Both our Monday classes here with currently 288 participants, which is amazing. And we also have our Wednesday conversation classes where we take Monday's topic and turn it into conversation starters where it will be in smaller groups. It will be off the record and you'll be able to actually converse, listen, and speak the Hebrew that you have currently at your proficiency level. If you've never joined us before for that, highly recommend doing that. Of course, it's also free. Registration details also on the website. And we have a whole bunch of topics coming up for the spring session, both with the natural calendar cycle this time of year. So lots of holiday themed classes coming up, some review like tonight, and some brand new topics we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing for the first time ever fitness and exercise terms in a few weeks. That's been a hot demand by participants. So we're excited to bring that, as well as add to classes we've already done in the past. So with that, we're about to get started. One last piece of housekeeping. If you've never joined us before, this is a frontal webinar. As I said, there are 298 of you. Folks, that's absolutely amazing that 298 from around the world are learning Hebrew at the same time. Trust me when I say this doesn't happen anywhere else. So once again, thank you to Nefesh B'Nefesh for providing us all this platform. If you're joining us live on Zoom, the Q&A is specifically for questions related to the topic we're about to discuss. Anything that's not related to this specific class, please put in the chat. The chat transcript I will be reviewing after class. The Q&A I'll only be reviewing during class, so please keep those relevant to the topic we're about to cover. If we have time, in addition to any questions about this specific class, I'll try to address those as well in the Q&A, but please, any questions you might have, chat is the best place. So with that, let's get started. So we're going to look at Hebrew grammar in a different way tonight. And this is a participant request that we cover this. And we've covered it in some ways in the past. And you're going to see, if you've watched our classes in the past, you'll see similar even slides come up with this one. But this is going to be a really important grammatical review. And I'm trying to keep it as level friendly as possible. So whether you're at a beginner's level or a more advanced level of Hebrew, I hope you can find something useful to take out of this class because it's a really important class. As I entitled it, right, as you see here, prefixes and suffixes, a few letters can say a lot. And we're going to talk a lot, as we've talked about in the past, about spelling. And spelling is really important in modern Hebrew because it not only impacts our pronunciation, it also impacts our understanding of what is trying to be communicated to us. And especially when we're learning the language, we have to understand the importance of what we call in Hebrew, otiot hashimush. Ot is a letter, otiot are letters, and shimush is use. Okay, so otiot shimush, useful letters or letters of use. I translate into prefixes and suffixes. Let's look at what I mean. First off, we got to do a little bit of grammar nerddom here and understand why we're going to talk about prefixes and suffixes in the first place. Modern Hebrew, if you look at how they talk about this in linguistic terms, is both analytical and agglutinative. Agglutinative, a wonderful word, right? Let's look at the sentence in English, and we're going to look at the sentence also in Hebrew, so please pay attention. When I discovered that your bag was next to me, I called you. A typical sentence in any language, especially in English and in Hebrew. For Hebrew learners, this is going to be a more advanced sentence, but in English, we'll hear this all the time, right? It's got all sorts of different things going on. But let's break it down in what we're talking about, analytical versus agglutinative. First off, we need to understand what a morpheme is. A morpheme is a unit in a given sentence, as it's written here. In English, right? English is a much more what we call analytical language, and we'll look at in a second. So when I look at the sentence, when I discovered that your bag was next to me, I called you. We can count at least 13 morphemes in the sentence, if not 15. Why? Look at each single word, which together is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13 words. And of those words, 2 of them are conjugated, right? The 2 verbs, discovered and called, right? It's not discover and call, it's discovered and called. So already those words are conveying more than just one unit of meaning, right? When is one unit of meaning in what we're talking about as morphemes? I is one thing. There's nothing attached to it, right? Discovered, however, does have something attached to it. It would be the equivalent of adding a prefix or suffix to it, right? That's as simple as it is. As I said, analytic means every part of speech is a separate word. Look at the sentence again. 13 words, right? 13 words. And altogether, it's almost 13 units, 13 morphemes, except for that conjugated discover and called, right? It means that we take the verb to discover and then we conjugate it by adding the suffix ed, which anyone who speaks English knows when you add ed to many verbs, it becomes the past tense. When I discovered. Okay? Another form of language, almost the opposite, is agglutinative, right? That word in itself is agglutinative, in that it's got a whole bunch of prefixes and suffixes attached to the root, which is glue, right? And the whole idea is that just like glue sticks to things and sticks things together, so too do agglutinative languages. They stick these morphemes, these individual units of words together, and it depends on the language. Some of you who are familiar, for example, with German, you know those really long words that end up being almost a whole sentence. That's a great example of what we're talking about here. As you see in this sentence, however, in English, we don't really have that, right? I discovered is two separate words. In many languages, including the one we learn here, Hebrew, that would be one word, okay? In other languages, such as Hebrew as well, next to me would be one word, count as one word. In Hebrew, in English, that's next to me, three different words, okay? So say right here at the bottom, English is much more analytic than modern Hebrew. We have many more separate words in English than we do in modern Hebrew. And modern Hebrew is much more analytic than ancient Hebrew. In ancient Hebrew, some of you may be familiar with biblical Hebrew, with Talmudic Hebrew, with prayer Hebrew, and that's all great. And that helps us sometimes fill in the gaps. But as we've talked about in previous lessons, please separate that away from modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew has its own grammar, sometimes even its own words that are different from other forms of Hebrew you may know. Okay, so I'm going to make it clear, modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew is more analytic than ancient Hebrew. It often takes more words to say the same thing than it did in ancient Hebrew. Okay, just one second. Okay, why is this important? Number one, Hebrew is a very efficient language. We talk about this all the time. Hebrew has up to 35 to 40,000 original words, meaning individual words that have their own meaning, and another 35 to 40,000 compound words, where we take those initial original words, put them together, and create new concepts. So for a very small amount of vocabulary, keep in mind English has roughly 250,000 words. Hebrew is a very efficient language. We really put a lot of meaning into individual words, right? And spelling rarely includes letters with no meaning or pronunciation, right? As opposed to certain languages like English, like French, like some others, we don't have a lot of silent letters, or those letters aren't just put there because of some archaic spelling and don't have any meaning. Almost everything that you read and write in modern Hebrew has meaning. Even if you don't pronounce the letter, it's got meaning. There's a purpose it serves for being there. Okay? Since all Hebrew nouns, verbs, and adjectives are comprised of a root and a form, and we talk about that a lot in this class, and we had a whole lesson several weeks ago in our winter session about understanding Hebrew simply as that, rather than learning, memorizing lists and lists of words. Prefixes and suffixes fill in the gaps in meaning and are easily recognized. The more you're familiar with Hebrew, as the next part says, the more you'll immediately recognize when it's a prefix or suffix and when it's part of the word's form or root itself. And we're going to look at some examples today. We're going to actually dissect a sentence and a specific word to see how we can figure this out and have some takeaway rules as well. First off, we've covered this table before, but I'm sharing it again because it's obviously really important because we are talking about prefixes and suffixes. Folks, this is all the prefixes and suffixes in the Hebrew language. And you can understand how we use them by being broken down into 5 categories. As you see here, you have 2 columns, prefix and suffix. If you forgot what that meant, prefix comes before the word, just like the prefix pre in English means before. A prefix comes at the beginning of a word. A suffix comes at the end of a word. Okay? That's simply what they mean. There are 5 categories, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? 5 categories of words in Hebrew that take prefixes and or suffixes. Let's look at them. Conjunctions and prepositions. Okay, this is the one you're going to find the most commonly used, and we're going to go through these in particular in a little bit. These will always come at the beginning of a word. Okay, so if you see these letters, let's reverse engineer what I just said. If you see these letters listed under conjunction and preposition at the beginning of a word, that should be an immediate red flag to you that this may be a prefix. It doesn't necessarily mean it will. We're going to look at some examples of that, but it's a good chance it is. Okay. The next one is one that's probably not explained to you so well when you're taking Ulpan or you learned Hebrew in day school or in Hebrew school or in yeshiva or even in university, but is an important one, is the letter mem. Mem is both a conjunction and a preposition, but it can also be the beginning of a present tense verb, some of the forms, and it can be the form of a participle. Okay? What does all that mean? A present tense verb in Hebrew, right? I'm doing something in the present. In modern Hebrew, we call that a different tense of verbs. In ancient Hebrew, and even according to strict rules of Hebrew grammar, that's what we call the participle. A participle in any language can be a noun, a verb, or an adjective. In Hebrew, we use participles all the time, right? We use them to describe things. We use them to give a lot more meaning to words. And oftentimes, in fact, all the time, participle can also be the present tense verb. We have a whole class on that. Highly recommend looking at that class, excuse me, in the past. But that is to say, many, 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 many words in Hebrew begin with the letter mem. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the preposition mem. It's sometimes just the marker to say this word is either a present tense verb and or a participle. So again, these are letters to watch out for. They always occur when we're talking about prefixes and suffixes, but they don't always mean that they are going to be prefixes and suffixes. And we're going to look at some rules, how to figure that out in a little bit. Okay. Suffixes also play a role in creating participles and present tense verbs. Everything that designates gender, is it masculine or feminine? Remember, all words in Hebrew are masculine and feminine. If it's plural or singular, that's also going to be in the suffix. The diminutive, you probably only at a more advanced level will you learn this. Diminutive simply means small. You can describe anything in Hebrew as small by adding the letters vav nun. So for example, yeled is a boy, yaldon is a little boy. Yes, you can say yeled katan, but you can also say yaldon. We also have in Hebrew the dual. We have singular and plural. We also have the dual. Those of you who know a little bit of Hebrew vocabulary, you know this as the suffix ayim. Einaim sheli. Ha einaim sheli, my eyes. Right? Ha oznaim sheli, my ears. Sfatayim, my lips. Right? That ayim at the end almost always designates the dual, two of something, if you didn't know what dual was, or a pair of something. Right? Possession, a really important one. We're going to go over also a little bit more in detail in a second. Possession will always be in the form of a suffix. Okay, always at the end of a word. These are all the different kinds that come as possessions at the end of the words. We're going to have a whole lesson just on possession because it's a really important point in Hebrew language and understanding how the language works. A whole separate lesson on that in a few weeks' time, but just as a reminder, it's there. Past tense verbs, gender and plural, also at the end. So when you're conjugating the past tense, what designates it as a past tense verb will come as a suffix at the end of the word. Future tense uses both prefix and suffix. Okay, this is a breakdown just where you're going to find prefixes and suffixes in Hebrew. Okay, 5 different categories. Are they prefix or suffix, or in some cases, both, where you can find them. Okay. I'm not asking you at this point to learn all of these, of course. You'll learn these in the course of regularly learning Hebrew. But sort of thinking about this reverse engineering, we're looking at the prefixes and suffixes we learn rather than rote memorization or rote conjugation and declension of nouns and verbs. Okay. Possession. Right? Possession. We're going to look at this in just a second. Modern Hebrew, possessive suffixes, right? These guys, right? These guys are right here, on the right-hand side, right? Possession right in the center of our table here. Possessive suffixes, right, are reserved for prepositions in general and the word shel, specifically to demonstrate possession, right? So if I want to say, in modern Hebrew, if I want to say my computer, hamachshev sheli, right? Shel is the word of in Hebrew, and I add the preposition that has to do with my, so first person, and I'm talking about a singular thing, computer. So hamachshev sheli. There is another form, as you see in our second part. Their attachment to nouns, while common, is considered a higher form of Hebrew and must be backed up with similarly weighted fluency. We got a question about this the other week, which is why I made sure to add this line. For example, as you see at the bottom, Hayeled sheli, my child, in fancier Hebrew, where we attach that possessive suffix to the end of the word, is yaldi, my child. Notice, even if this is too complicated for you, listen very carefully. Hayeled sheli, yaldi, right? That should be a clue. Hebrew uses the same formulas again and again to designate certain things. In this case, when you hear E at the end of a word, in this context, you know it probably has to do with something about possession in the first person, i.e. mine. Hayeled sheli, my child. The child of mine is the way you would literally translate that. And yaldi is my child. It's not just any yeled, it's yaldi, my child. And this form also exists in the plural. Hayeladim sheli, as opposed to hayeled sheli, my child. Hayeladim sheli, my children, right? Yeladim is the plural of yeled, is yeladai. Okay, that I at the end of a word often indicates plural first person possessive, my. Okay, yeladai. Okay, why am I putting this here? Because you will see it. You will certainly see it in ancient Hebrew and in liturgical Hebrew. In modern Hebrew, you'll see it in very literary forms. In literary forms, it's like I wrote a very high form of Hebrew. You won't speak like this. Or you won't speak like this until you become very fluent. It will sound disjointed if you try to speak like this while you're still forming your vocabulary, your everyday vocabulary. So best thing, you can always use shel. Hayeled sheli is the same exact thing as yaldi. Yaldi also sounds very literary and poetic, meaning you're not going to speak like that on a regular basis. Hey, hayeled sheli, my child. Simple as that. Okay. Now we're going to look at some of the most common of the prepositions and prefixes that you're going to use. Okay, and many of these are prepositions. If you don't remember what a preposition is, think about to, for, in, out, those types of words. Before, after, things that link a verb to the rest of the sentence and give some more detail. In Hebrew, a lot of these take the form of a prefix. As I wrote here, you can see a table, English on the right-hand side, the whole word, prefixes, and what do I mean by this? So first off, a lot of these prefixes are essentially contractions. They're part of a larger word. When we learn these in Ulpan or in when we're younger learning Hebrew, if those of us who are fortunate enough to have done that, you simply learn the prefix and it means a certain thing. So if you see the letter B at the beginning of a word and you determine that it's a prefix, it means in. And you're just taught that. Only later in Hebrew are you often taught that B stands for the word betoch. Right? Betoch is a single word. It means in, or more precisely within. But the letter bet at the beginning of a word, when it's not attached to the root or to the form of the word, means in. Ani babayit, right? I'm at home. Ani, I, babayit. I am in the house. Ba stands for in the. Be plus ha, bite, house. And on the left-hand side, you see a column that says elides with the definite article. If you don't know what the definite article is, folks, just think of the word the. Okay, it's a little bit more complicated than that, and English has done a good job of simplifying it, but not to a good place. Simply the. Okay, I am at home, meaning I am in the home. Ani bait. Okay, I am at home. Be can elide, meaning it can mush with ha, and it turns from be to ba. Okay, we take be, ha, turn into ba. That's a very important, fundamental, rudimentary aspect of knowing what level of Hebrew you're at when you learn which ones elide and which ones don't. Ani babait, I am at home. Okay? I can also say in Hebrew, ani betoch habayit. First off, no one will say it. And for good reason, because it sounds very haughty when you could say something very simple. Instead of ani babayit and you say ani betoch habayit, it translates first off as I'm within the home. It has the same similar meaning, right? What's the difference? Number one, and actually the whole point, is something we've talked about a lot here. And the reason why these are prefixes. Hebrew is an efficient language, as I said a few slides ago. Okay? It's an efficient language, meaning the fewer syllables, the fewer letters, the smaller the word, the better the language, the better the word is for transmitting meaning, i.e. communicating. Meaning Hebrew will always want fewer syllables, fewer letters. Ani bayit. 5 syllables. Ani betoch habayit. 7 syllables. 5 syllables will always win over 7 syllables. Whenever you have the choice in Hebrew of a sentence, 2 sentences that mean exactly the same thing, and the only difference is either the amount of letters or syllables, always go with the shorter one. Always. Okay? Great example here. So we did bit. Let's look at some others. This next one is only used in formal language, but it's important to point out, is the word, the letter hey. Now, when we learn hey, as I just said, it normally means the definite article, ha, okay, the. In formal Hebrew, it can also be the beginning of a question. Many of you who learn in Ulpan or in day school or in Hebrew school, like I originally did, learned the question word ha'im, right? If I took a poll of now 308 people on this call, the good chunk of you will have learned the word ha'im. I hate to break it to you. Almost no one uses the word ha'im in everyday modern Hebrew. The only places that's used is in very formal language, right? We learn that's the question word when it's not a normal question word like who, what, when, where, why, or how. We're supposed to use ha'im, right? Can I do something? Is it possible to do something? Is it going to rain tomorrow? We're taught incorrectly that in modern Hebrew, all those questions I just said have to begin with ha'im. Guess what? The vast majority of them don't in modern Hebrew. When you are speaking in everyday language, you are not going to use the word ha'im. You're rarely going to hear it at all. One of its vestiges, and every once in a while you'll hear it, is the prefix hey. So for example, if you have ever chewed bazooka gum in Hebrew, i.e. in Israel, and you open up the wrapper, and there's, the comics, and yes, there's a comic in Hebrew, just like there is in English and other languages, and it's got a factoid at the bottom. And what does the factoid begin with? Hayadata, question mark. Did you know? But it's not asking you yadata, simply did you know? The past tense of the verb lada'at, to know. And it's not asking ha'im yadata, that incorrect word. It's saying hayadata. It's truncating the ha'im into one word. Hayadata, did you know? Okay, formal, but important to know because a lot of you speak fancy English and fancy whatever else you speak. It's important to know these distinctions. Let's get to the next prefix. A very important one you'll see all the time, we use obviously all the time, is ve. Ve, and we're going to go over again in a little bit. The letter vav means and. Most of the time at the beginning of a word, if you see that letter, it's going to mean and. There are some exceptions, just like with all of these. The letter kaf at the beginning of the word, pronounced k, is short for kemo, which means as or like. Right? The letters kaf shin at the beginning of a word, pronounced as kshe, stands for ka'ashil, which means when. Lamed at the beginning of a word stands for el and can mean for, to, or towards. We use this one a lot in everyday Hebrew. Can you open, instead of saying in English, can you open, actually, no, we would say that in English too. Can you open this bottle for me? Right? In Hebrew, we'll say the same thing. Efshar liftoach li et habakbuk hazeh. Can you open this bottle for me? We just put the it in a different place, but li. Okay? Mem at the beginning of a word, sometimes, not always, as we just talked about, can stand for the word min, which means from. Mem nun sofi means from. And then finally, shin at the beginning of a word, not always, but again, you're going to use our clues that we're going to look at in just a second. Stands for asher, which means that or which. Okay. So let's look at a sentence. In fact, the sentence we just talked about in English. When I discovered your purse was next to me or your bag was next to me, I called you. Okay. This is how it reads in Hebrew. Now, let's take the very first word here. First off, this is a big sentence. This is a big sentence in English, and it's a big sentence in Hebrew. It's got a lot of words going on. And as opposed to English, remember that was 13 words. Look how many words it is here in Hebrew. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 words that in English took 13 to communicate. 7. So it means that we put together some of those same meanings, those same morphemes into prefixes and suffixes. And we're going to look at one of those in a second. But first, how do I approach this sentence, and especially words that look like they may have a prefix or a suffix, but I'm not sure? Let's take, for example, that first word here. Right? If the word looks long, is it potentially a foreign origin? Why am I starting off with this clue? Because of what I just said. Hebrew loves short words. So when you see a word with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 letters, some flags should be going up in your brain to say this word looks really long. Maybe it's a conjugated verb. Maybe it's got a prefixes or suffix, or maybe it's not Hebrew at all and it's some other word. Okay, I got to dig a little deeper, but Hebrew always likes shorter words because look at the rest of the sentence. With the exception of one other word that's 7 letters long, everything else is short. 3 letters, 4 letters. Right? Short words. We love short words in Hebrew. Okay? That's clue number 1. Can we determine the root letters of the words we don't know? This is one of the most important context clues you will ever get in Hebrew. Okay? Because all Hebrew words contain 2 things and 2 things only, a root and a form. For forms, for verbs, we call them a binyan, and for nouns and adjectives, we call them a mishkal. I have a whole lesson on that. We're going to review that in just a second as well. Right? So if I'm looking at any of these words, how do I determine, or can I determine, what the root letters are? The more we use Hebrew and the more we learn formally the grammar of it, and hopefully this is just a supplement to what you're learning, you will understand I can easily look at this first word and figure out its root. One of the reasons why I can figure out the root is because the root itself does not have much, if not any, of these letters, right? Once I know that prefixes and suffixes only come in these forms, I can look at a word like our first word in this sentence and rule out a whole bunch of things. For example, right? Let's look at that list again. Conjunctions and prepositions, and one of the very first in the prefix is not just kaf, which is the beginning of our word, but it's also kaf shin. So let's go back to this word, and it begins with kaf shin. I just learned because Jay just showed me this other handy dandy chart that kaf shin here in the middle means when. When is a beginning of a sentence, right? It's actually the beginning of our um, sentence in English. So even if I didn't know the word in English, I can deduce or I can assume perhaps these two letters are not part of the root and won't give me away the whole meaning of the word, but maybe it's a prefix. And if it's a prefix, I already know the first word of the sentence, when. Okay. Even if you don't understand, you can start deducing based on some logic and the way Hebrew works and is always predictable to work as such. Okay, so can we determine the root letters of the words we don't know? Right now we can't, but we can deduce what letters may or may not be based on other things we see. For example, what are the potential prefixes and suffixes? But it could also be part of the root, right? I look at this first word, and um, we're gonna look at it more in detail in just a second, right? Gimel and Gimel did not include in that list, right? I did not see any prefix or suffix that included or began with the letter Gimel. So probably Gimel is one of our root letters. Okay. Yud was there in a lot, and Lamed was there in a lot. But at least I know Gimel has to be somewhere in the root, because the opposite is true. There are no potential prefixes and suffixes that Jay just showed me that begin with Gimel. Okay. What context clues are there to further give meaning to the word? In other words, let's look at the whole sentence. I see there's a comma, and I see that there's a shorter, maybe clause, maybe full sentence afterwards, meaning I can figure out the rhythm of the sentence, especially if I know other words. And I can figure out based on all sorts of other context clues that may not be immediately relevant to me in this specific case, but maybe in everyday life. How someone's talking, their tone may change, their gesticulations, nonverbal communication may have changed, right? There are other things to fill in meaning that may not be so immediately apparent if I'm just fixating on one word. What pronunciations can we rule out? And we're going to talk about that in just a second. When do I know certain letters, for example, are pronounced one way versus another? When do I know it has a dot in it or not is a big one that we often ask when we're learning Hebrew. And then finally, based on how Hebrew sounds, right? And the words we know and have heard before, what is the logical pronunciation of the words we don't know? Okay, so even if I don't know this word or I'm starting to figure it out, there are ways, because Hebrew is a repetitive and efficient language, I can figure out how to pronounce this. Okay. Let's look at our word. Okay. This word at the beginning of the sentence is pronounced kshegiliti. Kshegiliti. Kshegiliti is comprised of three different things that all form one word in Hebrew. The prefix kaf shin, as we talked about, kshe, means when. The verb is to discover, right? Our English sentence, when I discovered. The root is gimel lamed he, so that gimel already gave me a clue as to what this verb is. And that taf yud at the end of a sentence, especially a word verb like this, especially a word like this, excuse me, gives away almost all the time. Not always, but in this specific case, and in many, many other cases, this is conjugated for past tense first person singular. When I blank ed. Okay, in this case, when I discovered. Okay. Kshegiliti is a very efficient word because in one word, and with the help of a prefix and a suffix, we've determined this word means when I discovered. In English, that's three words. In Hebrew, it's one. Kshegiliti, when I discovered. Okay. That's what we're talking about with prefixes and suffixes. Think beyond prefixes and suffixes in English and in your respective other languages that you may speak or know. Okay. In Hebrew, these work a lot, not just with everyday things, but they also fill in the gaps when it comes to conjugating verbs and doing possessive things and all sorts of other important everyday functions of Hebrew. And that's why it's called otiot shimush, helpful, useful letters that guide us in understanding a word and its meaning. Okay. Let's look at some other help when we're looking at these words in the little time we have left, so I can answer some questions in the Q&A. First off, the letter Vav, right? The letter Vav in Hebrew, when we talk about meaning and, it's called Vav HaChibur. Chibur means connecting. Okay, so Vav HaChibur, the connecting Vav, right? The letter Vav at the beginning of a word means and. You have to be careful though. Non-English words, specifically that begin with a V or W in English, will often be transliterated with the Vav. So it's not always the case, as I've kept saying tonight. In front of most letters, the vowel underneath this letter is silent. V, ve'ulai, and maybe. Okay. In front of the letters bet, vav, mem, and pe, and those with the silent vowel becomes u. Uva leilot, and in the nights. Right? This is called in Hebrew chok habumf. That basically says exactly that. Right? If a front of the letters bet, vav, mem, pe, there's a vav, it's pronounced u. In front of vowels that begin with the chataf vowel, meaning the flat bar a, it adopts the following vowel, va'ani, and me. And in front of a yud with the silent vowel, the two letters become a v. Eretz Tzion v'Yerushalayim. One of the many mistakes many people make when they sing Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, is the last three words. Eretz Tzion v'Yerushalayim. It's not Eretz Tzion Yerushalayim, it's Eretz Tzion v'Yerushalayim. Okay, why do I include this in here? Because again, we have people coming from all sorts of different levels. This may be a little too nuanced, too esoteric, too advanced for some people, and for others, this scratches their immediate itch. I don't know how to read this letter Vav. I want to make it sound right. Here are the rules. Okay, and Vav is one of our otiot shimush, one of our prefixes that we use all the time, right? There's no independent word in Hebrew that means and. It is a prefix, the letter Vav. Another important one, because several of our prefixes, such as bet and kaf, also can have a dot in it, and the dot changes the sound, and that's an important one. We also have the prefix taf. Taf is the beginning of many Hebrew verbs in the future tense. All the verbs, in fact, in second person, you, future tense, all begin with taf. So we need to know how to pronounce it. The dot found in bet, kaf, pe, and taf as well is called a dagesh, and it changes the sound of a letter to an implosive and to be pronounced in words beginning with said letters. Okay? Ani poteach sefer shel filosofia. Poteach. If a word begins, a Hebrew word, Hebrew in origin word like poteach, opens, begins with a pe, you pronounce it with the dot in the middle, poteach. Okay, all of this is important. I'm not going to go through all this. This is to say, there are ways to learn how to pronounce the language, not just in order to read it and understand it. And this is the other one I was talking about beginning. This one I think is probably, we had a whole lesson on this in a few weeks ago. This to me is the equivalent of the matrix when learning Hebrew, and I've talked about this before. I will always talk about this. I don't think formal Hebrew education in the 21st century does justice to how important understanding this point in Hebrew grammar is, because this unlocks so much more meaning than we ever have available other than just memorizing thousands of words. In verbs, the more advanced levels you get, you learn about binyanim. These are how verbs are constructed and conjugated. It makes sense of all verbs because it also gives you the meaning behind verbs. The same thing happens for nouns and adjectives. The difference is, as opposed to 7 binyanim for verbs, there are dozens of mishkalim. Even native Hebrew speakers only learn a few of them, but this radically changes how we can understand a Hebrew word and how to create Hebrew words. And we have a whole lesson, like I said, about that. But this also goes to understand why so many Hebrew words begin with the letter mem. Really important, folks. Many Hebrew words, like I said at the beginning of our class, begin with the letter mem. Why? Because many of these mishkalim to create nouns and adjectives begin with the letter mem. So for example, place holders, and not placeholders, excuse me, places, actual places, locations, have the form miktala, mi-a-a. They will begin with the letter mem and will have the vowel pattern i-a-a. Misada, the place where one dines. To dine, D-I-N-E, is lisod. Misada is the place where one dines. Mirpa'a is the place where one gets refu'ah, healing. Mirpa'a, a health clinic, the place where you get health. Okay, that mem is part of the mishkal, and it's not from something, right? And many beginner Hebrew learners will say, well, wait a minute, there's a mem at the beginning of the word. It must mean from. I said repeatedly throughout this class, it doesn't always mean from. Sometimes it's part of the form of the word itself, like in this case. Miktala, I have all sorts of forms like this. But the point is a mem, there's a reason why if you open up a dictionary in Hebrew, so many words begin with mem, because it creates a lot of the forms for nouns and adjectives. Okay, so takeaway rules for prefixes and suffixes. Number one, deep breath. Go at your own pace. This was a lot for, just under an hour to go through, and it's a lot of grammar. It's a lot of heady grammar too, that you probably don't even know in your own native language. So go slow. There is no race here. Number two, find the words you definitely know how to pronounce. They're your anchors. We talk about this when trying to read words in any context, especially ones that don't have nikud, the dots and bars that indicate vowel sounds. Okay. So find the words that you can pronounce. Don't necessarily go in a linear manner. Take a sentence, mark it up. Find the ones that you recognize. See if there's a root that you recognize. And then start looking for the prefixes and suffixes. What are the potential ones there? But that could also be part of the root. Start marking off the ones. You have that table now, and this whole lesson will be sent to you, obviously, with the recording. Right, you have that table. You can now look at that sentence, that big long sentence here, which by the way is pronounced "Kshegiliti shehatik shelcha haya liadi, hitkasharti elecha." In this sentence, by the way, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 prefixes and suffixes that we covered. Okay? Once you learn them, you go through using this table here. You can take that sentence. You can start marking off all the times you see these letters at the beginning or end of a word, right? Prefixes and suffixes. It's not the middle of the word. It's not anywhere other than the beginning or the end of a word. And you can start making educated guesses based on that. Okay? And finally, sound out the words you don't know. Maybe it's based on what you've learned. Maybe it's based on what a native Israeli would say, right? Get into the mind of a native Israeli, and that's why it's so important to simply listen, not always talk. Communication is as much about talking as it is about listening, right? And make educated guesses. It's the reason why, by the way, I put in these very, very complicated, maybe potentially complicated for some people, grammatical rules, because they make understanding how to pronounce things and is it a prefix, simply part of the word, more accessible. Okay, first off, before I get to questions, I want to say toda rabba. Thank you all so much for joining. I promise you, if this is your first time, not all of our classes are going to be this heady. Next week's class, for example, is all about Purim. Right? It's all about the next holiday. That's all we're going to talk about is Purim. We go back and forth between grammar and that because to use Hebrew every day means you got to know a little bit of grammar, but you also got to know everyday topics. The next big holiday is a big one. We're going to talk about how it's celebrated here in Israel. First off, it's the pronunciation of the word. We're going to go through that again, as well as unique things to celebrating the holiday in Israel. Right? For those of you who want more practice with what we just covered, please join us for our Wednesday class. Whether you want the practice for this specific topic or in general want to practice your conversation skills. This Wednesday, we're going to take our topic of prefixes and suffixes, and all of our conversation starters are going to force you to use prefixes and suffixes, whether you like it or not. Every question and answer you give will have to have prefixes and suffixes. So you're going to regularly use them and get used to the pattern of knowing when to put them in, knowing when to recognize them. Okay. So with that, I have a little bit of time to answer Q&A. If I don't get to your questions listed in the Q&A, please write to us, hebrew@nbn.org.il. The recording of this class, along with the presentation you just saw, will be available to you in the next day or so. Okay. Um, Great question. Yeladai and Yaldi are both spelled the same. How would I read the difference between vowels? Great question. So in the because we have a lot of beginners in this class, I use I put the nikud in. The nikud are those dots and bars that indicate vowel sounds. In Hebrew, we call that ktiv chaser. It means lacking or absent writing. Why? Because the opposite is ktiv maleh. Ktiv maleh is complete writing. If I were to write yeladai without that, and you'll see that in our neat sheet, you'll see that in our possessive list. Where are we? Yeladai is included in here in possession, right? It is here in the double as a double yud. We're going to go over that in a few weeks. Like I said, possession. We're going to go through all the different things, including how to write out possession. That is to say, when you put the dots and bars in Hebrew, it will drop what we call emot kriya, the letters that make up ktiv maleh. So if I was to write yeladai without dots and bars, for people who can read without nikud, without vowel sounds, it would have two yuds. But because they're there, there's only one yud. Great question. Do any of these prefixes and suffixes function like the declension case system in languages like Russian and Assyrian, dative, genitive, accusative? Oh, thank you for asking this question. That scratches my linguistic itch. Hebrew's very simple. We don't really have a whole lot of cases in Hebrew. We have past, present, and future tense. We have active and passive voice. We have conditional and imperfect, but that is used by separate words. We don't have everything else. We don't have perfect. We don't have all the other ones that you would ask. Accusative, we talked about a little bit with the letter hey at the beginning of a word. But everything else is very straightforward. We don't have nearly as many cases, such as in Arabic or in German, or in this case, Russian. But great question. You said always go with the least syllables, but you also said that modern is more analytic and thus has less syllables. Would you say use the least amount of syllables unless it is ancient word? Great question. Yes. Ancient words will always take precedence in Hebrew. Because that is part of our heritage and that is the fundamentals of our language. And if it's a word that has lasted that long, it usually has heritage, meaning it has preference. That being said, if there are words that you can say with fewer syllables, that will always be preferable. With Giliti, did you need the first yud? Yes. Giliti is the way it is conjugated. It absolutely needs to be in there. That is part of the conjugation. It needs to be Giliti. When do you know if a word is in correct order, like Adam, go to, not go to Adam? Great question. We have a whole class on word order and sentence structure in Hebrew, so definitely check it on YouTube. Okay, just seeing how many more. We're running out of time. In the example sentence you used, how did you know that it was a male person to call versus a female? Great question. So let's look again at our sentence. So you're absolutely right in asking this question. I don't. If I just saw the sentence written as opposed to being spoken, I don't know who the last word refers to. The last word in the sentence is to you, right? I called you in English. In Hebrew, that has gender. Everything up until that word says nothing about the gender of the person I'm speaking to or the person who's speaking. That last word I translated as I pronounced as elecha, because also the default in Hebrew is always to the male, but that could have been elaich, to you, feminine. How do I know that? Context. I won't know the gender until I get more context of who's speaking here and who's listening. But if I were just to read this, I wouldn't know. That's a very valid question. Okay. So with that, unfortunately, we are out of time, and I know I didn't get to all your questions in the Q&A, so please be in touch by email, or more importantly, equally importantly, you can join us on Wednesday, because not only will you have the chance to practice the Hebrew we learned here and all the Hebrew you already have, at any level, by the way, we have very much beginners who join us to absolute advanced, and you'll be placed in your with like-minded and like-spoken participants. But we will have time for more Q&A at the end of class on Wednesday. Same time, 8 p.m. here on Zoom. Registration is both in the chat and on Nefesh B'Nefesh's website. Toda rabah. Thank you all for joining. If I don't see you this Wednesday, I hope to see you next Monday, where we talk about all things Purim. Until then, lihitraot. Take care.